Are there questions from the audience? Maybe I'll just give you a couple of minutes time to think about it and type in or open your mic if you have one. Bettina wants to say something. Okay, Bettina wants to say something. Bettina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, Victor. Thank you so much for this really stimulating and interesting talk. I have a number of questions concerning the labeling. I guess I agree with you about the conclusions, but of course, the whole analysis hinges very much on how you labeled things and what errors, okay, whether we call them errors, biases, the point of view depends on what we want to achieve. But in a sense, what I understand is you started from the self-declared policies, very verbally, vaguely described policies of Facebook. And they probably have some kind of code book for their internal coders, which isn't disclosed. And then from that results some classifier, and you had a different code book. And so my first question would be, did you disclose that code book? Did Facebook say anything about it? What errors? Okay, you said something about the inter-rater agreement there. And is that, did you really hand label all these hundreds of thousands, or did you also employ machine labeling there?
Yeah.
And what kind of effects might you have had from this process?
Yeah. We took two different approaches to identify the false positives and the false negatives, respectively. For the false positives, so these are the ads that were detected by Facebook and that were that we wanted to consider as not political. There you really have to look at the content of the ads. So you have no other metadata, you have no other signals that you can use to like classify in bulk whether the ad should or should not be political. So that's why we relied on a manual sample. We took 600 ads from the US. We had 3 annotators label the ads, again, to avoid some of these biases by just having one person, let's say, label the ad and one interpretation of the policy. So we specifically asked the 3 annotators, look very carefully at Facebook's policy. Do not attach your own interpretation of what should be a political ad. Focus on what Facebook states as being a political ad. And try to, in a first instance, just label the ad as political or not. That was the primary label that we attached to an ad. So does this ad fall under Facebook's policy, yes or no? We separately also had a code book that correlated with the themes in the ads and correlated with whether the ad was political or not political. That's in the appendix of our paper. So we do list the specific topics that we consider political, not political, and that we use to label the different ads. Facebook has not said anything about the specific code book. Facebook has been somewhat quiet about our research in general, so they do not really have a strong opinion on that. So we labeled these 600 ads, and we just extrapolated the percentage that we saw there in the paper. Again, we give like the confidence interval for our false positive rate based on the number of ads that we were able to label. But we do believe that given the fact that we have multiple annotators who all independently labeled the ad, that if the labelers disagreed, we do not label it as either political or not political. We have a separate category for the disagreements. That's what I highlighted, that there were a large number of ads where actually our interpretations did not align. So even we couldn't really decide or interpret Facebook's policy properly to understand whether, or interpret it consistently to understand whether the ad was political or not. But for the false positives, all 3 annotators agreed that the ad was not political in nature, according to Facebook's own definition. And again, this high false positive rate was also confirmed by prior and independent and other research. For the false negatives, so these are the ads that were missed by Facebook, that should have been detected, but that weren't. We did an analysis in bulk, but it was not in terms of a process learning anything. There we could rely on metadata. So we relied on this metadata of the category that the page declares itself to be, or the external lists. So we just took all the pages that we knew to be clear political actors. Although we also did confirm that with like a small sample analysis of a small sample, and there we found that like 50 out of the 50 pages that we looked at were clearly political actors. Because technically you could have pages who label themselves as a politician, but aren't really. But in our manual sample, that does not appear. So for those clear political actors, where Facebook's definition explicitly states, and I'll get the definition even, that ads made by a candidate for public office, a political figure, political party, political action committee, or etc., that any ad made by them is considered a political ad by Facebook's own definition. So what we could then do is for those ads, for those pages in bulk, look at all the ads that they did not declare. So this number of 116,000, it's an absolute figure. It's not an extrapolation of anything. It's not something it's not an estimate. It's 116,000 individual ads were published by a page where the metadata tells us it's a political actor, but where the ad itself does not have the label of being a political ad. So those are the two different approaches.
Okay. And if I may ask one more little question, you reported a very high false positive rate, and of course, whether that is a problem or not will also depend on what you can do or what you have to do as an advertiser if you are wrongly flagged. And if that's just like a minimal, easy, pain-free thing, then it probably is a good thing to push the classifier towards towards not minimizing the false positives. Can you comment on that?
I can comment on that. Of course, we do not have insight into Facebook system and to Facebook review system as such, but we do see anecdotal reports from the press, from prior instances and incidents, that especially smaller advertisers do really have a very difficult time navigating this rebuttal system, let's say, from Facebook, and that it's very difficult for them to actually like have these false positives retracted and have as we reinstated. And also in terms of the numbers, we saw ads that like were detected at some point and then were like undetected again. So this political label was retracted. But that was only for like 1.16% of the detected ads. So if the case would be that a lot of false positives happen, but advertisers are easily and at large scale able to have that label undone, then we would expect this percentage to also be much higher. So this appeal process is only applied to like 1% of ads.
Thank you.
Well, even if it would be easier, I mean, a smaller player might depend on ads to be coming out immediately because it's related to an ongoing campaign or something like that. So even blocking such a player for one day might have huge impact on their voice being heard.
Yes, and especially again those press reports, they talked a lot about commercial providers like companies, but quite often these companies have some sort of social issue related aspect. A lot of these companies, for example, they focus on the fact that they are women-owned, that they are owned by African Americans, LGBTQ people, or that they sell specific products that may be somewhat separate outside of the mainstream. I saw some examples of advertisers who sold wheelchairs or certain products for handicapped people or products related to like body image and stuff, where basically the fact that Facebook takes down these ads and says to the advertiser, hey, we think this ad like is advocating for a social issue and you should have declared it and you should have indicated that you're trying to influence people. It gives a suggestion also to these advertisers that what they're doing and what they're focusing on is a social issue, is something up for debate, even though maybe the public opinion would actually not consider it up for public debate. Like it's a settled issue to some extent. And just this fact that Facebook is like labeling these ads and notifying these advertisers also it scares advertisers maybe to some extent, because they think, oh, maybe we shouldn't be advertising on Facebook because Facebook might think that what we're trying to do is like influencing people and doing advocacy for this issue, even though we're just like a genuine company who just has like a certain like property, a certain characteristic that we want to like use, that we think is like a commercial advantage, or that our consumers might find interesting. But that Facebook considers to be like influential and requires some additional transparency and additional process. So it also gives this kind of suggestion that certain things are unwanted on Facebook almost, just by having these topics being considered as social issues or political ads.
And the process in general is fully automated. There's no supervision involved from the side of Facebook or an independent.
What do you mean with the process?
There
are many processes.
Okay, there are many, those many processes, the many processes that label a ad as political and potentially problematic.
In Facebook's own words, it's largely automated review, artificial intelligence. Sometimes they will pass on an ad to a team of human reviewers. So that also already suggests that like it will go to the automated system, then it flags something, or like there's a user report coming in. I think Facebook also relies somewhat heavily maybe on reports from users. So for every ad, you can click it and you can say, I think this ad should be taken down because it is political. Maybe that also maybe that's the core of Facebook's enforcement, relying on people actually submitting ads to them instead of actually doing their own enforcement. But indeed, if Facebook systems kick into action, it's mostly like an automated thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we do see some errors, not as many as we would maybe have expected, but we also see some errors that relate just to like very silly keyword matching. I saw an ad for a supermarket which was located in the Senator XYZ street. It had the word senator, so Facebook thought, that's about senators, it's a political ad, we should take it down. So you also have like this very coarse, very like rudimentary keyword matching that also happens.
Okay, interesting. There is an interesting question that relates here from Eric online. So did you see advertisers that deliberately try to confuse or irritate these algorithms to get things through classification that otherwise would be classified as political?
We did not really look at the content of the ad, so I wouldn't really be able to comment on that. We looked specifically at, let's say, this metadata, this label of is the ad political or not political. We didn't have the resources or the space, let's say, to really look at the content at this time. It will be really interesting to also have a look at the content. It's just, again, especially with the lack of insight into how Facebook systems work and how they enforce their policies, it would be quite difficult to attach reliable conclusions to this, I would say. Again, because we do not know what they take into account. It appears that, for example, they do not take the advertiser into account, so the page itself. So that already like removes certain factors that you might expect to have an influence, like the category, even like the size of the page or whatever. But we did not see any we did not look at whether the content was adversarial to try and circumvent the system or not.
You mentioned this focus on transparency a couple of times from Facebook's side. Is there legislation in place that forces them to focus on transparency, or where does that come from?
I think in a first instance, so there's currently not really any legislation. I think it comes from like a sense of just have the public take care of this issue. So again, like if you have transparency, that's like partial solution, and you can just say to everybody, like, you can look at all the ads. If you see something bad, let us know. And that kind of takes away this requirement of having to really properly enforce their policies. But in like proposals for legislation, we also see like a high emphasis on transparency. So like I said, the European Union, the European Commission and Parliament are implementing two major packages of legislation. One is a Digital Services Act, which basically requires transparency for all ads, but with not as much metadata as we would like, but not as much data access as we would like. So there they specifically speak about vetted academic researchers, but there's of course also an interest for journalists and civil society organizations and even the public to have a look at this data and to be able to understand these issues. Separately, they've also proposed regulations specifically for paid political advertising. Their transparency would be a little bit broader, so it would be access for all, more metadata that is available. But again, these proposals mainly focus on, again, you need more transparency, and that kind of will solve the issue. What was very interesting but somewhat alarming to read, for example, also in this regulation on political advertising, is that they also talk about what should the platforms do, like the platforms should indicate on an ad that it is political, etc. But they very specifically say, the regulations very specifically states, platforms should have a way for users to report that an ad was not properly declared. But nowhere in there is there an article that says platforms should proactively try to enforce the policy and take down these political ads. So again, it seems that this enforcement, which is still required to be able to like be trusted to have these policies and run advertising on the platform, that this kind of enforcement part is really like neglected in favor of, if just there's transparency, which of course I would welcome, and it would allow us to like propose solutions, but that this transparency aspect is seen as the holy grail, which will solve all of the issues. But it's only a first step towards better enforcement, better accountability, and then the better security and less violating content on these platforms.
Okay, I want to raise a question that is posed by Robin in the chat. He is wondering if this focus on transparency also potentially enables malicious actors to circumvent detection. Can this be used to, like, in a context of malicious learning or something like that, to construct things that make sure that your ads are not being detected?
Technically, that could probably be the case, indeed. You give an insight into how Facebook system works, yes and no, because again, you have like this large body of correctly declared ads where it's the advertiser declaring the ads as political. So there you might also have noise in the sense of advertisers just declaring all their ads just because, without any reason why. And actually, there has been previous research which was very interesting, which showed that, which proved that depending on what input you give to these like automated classifiers, you do see like a very different definition of political ads coming out of them, basically. So depending on whether you include only those ads that were detected or those ads that were correctly declared, depending on what you give to the algorithm, it will have like a very different output. So again, that this is basically like a big black box and you do not really have a lot of insight into how these systems work. Of course, you can also always train like adversarial models which try to circumvent these enforcement processes. But to some extent, they will still battle with the same issues that we have in terms of like limited insight, limited data, that might cause them to actually not perform well. Plus, you also have to, of course, take into account you can drive this adversarial thing to infinity, but you still, of course, have to have the message come across. Like you can't start changing words, make a message illegible just to try and circumvent the system. So you have to make sure that people are able to do this. Although maybe just as an anecdote, what we do see sometimes is that they try to use like, it's called homoglyphs. So it's like characters that look like other characters. So you do already see some ways of trying to circumvent the system. And again, it's also for me as a security researcher, I'm very interested in these problems, and I would be very, 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 very happy if I got like full insight into all ads that run on Facebook. I would be able to do so much research to look at so many things, and I would actually be able to like make the public aware, make Facebook aware of these issues, and try to propose and implement solutions. That's also like for Facebook, they should embrace this. They should embrace this interest, and they should embrace people actively trying to help them to improve the security of their own platform. So again, with this transparency, if you give people data that will work with it, and they will try to do good things with it.
So the API that they have, does it give you access to the classifier? Can you actually put historic ads back into the classifier and see? No, okay.
No. It's literally just a repository of ads, and it comes with its own issues. So we had to build like a custom tool for the web portal, but even the API itself, it's clearly not. They're clearly not putting the best programmers and developers on this API. Like my colleagues, they have been working with this API for a while, and basically it breaks quite often. Data disappears and it reappears. It's like very difficult to like extract all of the data from the API. So even the tools that Facebook propose are not always very, very useful to researchers to be able to do these kind of things.
Yeah, I see. You had pretty cool data about detection rates across the US, which I believe is linguistically and politically a slightly more homogeneous base than the European Union.
Yes and no, because especially in the US, you have like two major languages, English and Spanish.
Yeah.
So again, we did not really look at the content or, for example, also the languages. I know that there's other research ongoing that tries to look more into like, is there a difference in detection and content and approach between English and Spanish speaking, English and Spanish language ads. Of course, also in a European context. So in a US context, the unit is the US, and then you have multiple languages within this country. In Europe, as for Facebook, these are also like individual units. Their report is like separated by country. The API, you can collect data by country. So actually, maybe within one country, actually in Europe, you might have more homogeneity just because you have like one single language, except for cases like Belgium, of course. But it's not necessarily the case that it's not necessarily because US or Europe. It's just more in terms of like communities get smaller, communities get more diverse. So there is also just a lack of data, I think. Like language models are the smaller the language, the less well trained and the less often used these language models are. Like in the US, you see with all these major tech platforms, all of the cool shiny things that use AI, they all work in US English just because the data is there, the user base is there, and once you get with smaller.
Yeah, it's a funny thing because like Spanish is the much more widely spoken language on the world, right? So it's
multiplied by, of course, the amount of money that people pay.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, for Facebook, like their home base is the US, so the scrutiny is here. Like the politicians are here, the lobbying is here. Europe is still strong in that regard. Unfortunately, like the rest of the world, probably Facebook is just not as afraid of them. Like if they lose the user base in one country, it's not good, but it's not like they will lose their core user base. So it's also it's really this constellation of investment, importance, possibility for like repercussions. It's really there that Facebook makes like commercial decisions. I mean, they're a company, they want to make as much profit as possible, and they make kind of a commercial decision to invest more in one place and less in another. But given their scale and given like the outsized influence that they can have on users, on the political process, on just like life on the internet in general, it's no longer possible for them to just have profit as their primary target. They have to take responsibility for the fact that these platforms reach basically almost every human on the globe, and that they should take this into account. To like make investment decisions, make decisions on how they want to protect their users. They do bear a responsibility at this point to make sure that their users are protected when they're using these platforms.
Bettina, please.
Yeah, sorry, switch this off in the meantime. This is really following up on what you just said about the combination of language and money and so on. I mean, there is an incredible imbalance, and it's even the number, if you look at the number of people in one particular country, it's not at all a predictor, or the number of people of one particular language, it's not at all a predictor of how many human classifiers are being assigned to critical tasks such as hate speech detection and so on. So Myanmar is like the example that's often being cited with nearly 60 million people and like 5 coders or something. I don't have a real source for the number 5, but it's a super number. And your outlier, your big outlier was Malaysia, which probably has similar issues. And but the question is really, is it in any way realistic to say Facebook has the obligation to take care of its markets where it can't make any money? I mean, who's putting that kind of obligation on a company, profit-seeking company, be it not politicians that actually regulate in certain markets and say it doesn't matter to us how much money you make in our country. These are the rules. So I think that's a very tricky kind of statement to make, but the transparency of the effects of these imbalances, I think that's very, very important, because we can show that with the methods like yours, and that's probably not so well known among people who are not so familiar with what coding means.
Although, of course, we also want to have some sort of impact. Of course, we can show it as much as we want.
Yeah.
Of course, if then Facebook does nothing, then you still have these people remain vulnerable to these issues. So you can say it as much as you want, and of course, somebody has to say it. But still, in the end, it should lead to certain action. So we do think that in the end, Facebook should step up its game and try to make sure that also people in these like more diverse, more vulnerable communities are also protected, because otherwise, it has a ripple effect, of course, as well. Like if you want to be very grim, like if a war breaks out in one of these countries because of this kind of disinformation spreading on these platforms, which has happened, like even on a human level, you just do not want to have that happen. So it's not necessarily each country for its own. It's really like it's a global system as well. It's a global company, it's a global system, so they should make sure that their global user base is equally protected.
Is there similar related work on this for other platforms?
In terms of the audits, not really, as I'm aware. So there are like smaller studies. There's one smaller study which also looked at Google, but as in hundreds of ads that were studied. Facebook has to be commended. I think their transparency implementation is one of the most accessible. It's not super accessible, but it's one of the most accessible. And their policy is also one of the broadest. So, for example, Google, like I said, it only covers election ads running in a few months before a certain election, only by politicians. They publish other kinds of metadata online. They do not publish active ads. That's actually a crucial factor. Like that's why we advocate for transparency for all ads, just because these other platforms do not publish all of the ads, the non-political ads that are available on the platform. So there's no real way to, at scale, know which ads have been missed. So the only thing you can then do, and that's also projects that my colleagues at NYU are implementing, is projects where you collect data from the users. So my colleagues at NYU have the Ad Observer plugin, which I all recommend you to install and install in your browsers. So this extension looks at the Facebook news feeds, collects all the ads it sees there, it reports them back anonymously without any like identifying metadata. And then you can build like a separate repository of like non-political ads and try to, from there, like also select certain ads that have not been detected by Facebook or Google or whatever. But it's very difficult to do this at the same scale. Like I think their user base is over 10,000, maybe 15,000, but you will never get like very complete coverage from that. But it's basically the best way possible given the circumstances. But ideally, you would have, again, like transparency for all ads, mandatory comprehensive transparency, just to ensure that we can also like find those ads that have not been properly declared.
Yeah, I see. Okay, I have strong intentions to let Victor go in the next 5 minutes, so this is your last chance to put questions. Bettina, please.
I'm really sorry. This is my last question.
No.
You had this extra slide pretty much at the beginning that there were changes even after your paper, and if I understood that right, they were a real bummer. I mean, if you declare your ad as commercial, then you can do whatever you want. I mean, come on, this can't be true.
For social issue ads. So indeed,
Yeah.
they changed the policy last month that if like the example was always like if an ad says buy our green energy, is that a commercial ad? Is that a social issue ad? Are you advocating for like social issue? Yes or no? And Facebook in the blog post, I literally say like, yeah, we heard a lot of feedback from advertisers, and they did not really like this policy. So we agree, so we will change our policy. So indeed, like if a social issue ad is primarily commercial, it might not, it does not require authorization. Like one example, which if you read like if you read the examples and it gets very silly. Like it says like if you sell a product and 100% of the proceeds go to a good cause, it's a social issue ad and you have to declare it. If it's less than 100%, it's not a social issue ad and you do not have to declare it. So I'm looking forward to the first ad, which has like 99% of the proceeds going to a good cause, just to circumvent this policy. So again, you introduce these kind of exceptions and rules, and then an exception to the exception, and it becomes very hard to navigate. It becomes very hard to enforce. It becomes very hard to audit. And again, it shows that like people will try to like argue that hey, no, our ad is commercial. We are selling a T-shirt with like a political message and a social issue message. So again, it will leave a lot of room for like debate, for like controversy, maybe to some extent. And again, like if we do, I think people are quite unaware of this change in policy. Of course, Facebook will not like advertise it widely. They will not like announce to the public. They will always announce to the public if they have some additional transparency, or if they do something that they think in the public eye will be something that people consider very important or very beneficial. But like this change, we noticed it 1 month after it happened, just because it's like in the small text box on the page about political ad policies. By the way, we're changing this like small subset of the policy, but if you actually click through, you see that actually quite a major change. So indeed, we find it quite worrying that Facebook is kind of like making its policy less strict, so requiring fewer ads to be declared. And again, I think especially this implementation and this the way it's written, it leaves a lot of room for people trying to just evade and circumvent this policy just by having some sort of small change or small addition that makes their ad in the view of Facebook commercial.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess in particular from smaller players, there is a huge incentive to do so, right? I mean, accounts get banned for misclassifications and things like that. So yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how do we handle this? More regulation, community-driven management, consider social networks as infrastructure and regulate them from a completely different perspective.
Especially, well, I think it's certainly a combination of these things. So you need some regulation again, because these platforms have like an outsized reach and outsized responsibility. So it's no like this profit-seeking motive is probably no longer sufficient to be able to handle these issues well. And again, to be able to hold these platforms accountable, you do also need like insight and transparency. So you need to have like to provide people with the means to be able to understand how these platforms work and what their influence is. So again, we know that they have a large influence, but it's only through these kind of audits and through this kind of transparency and access that we can also like quantify and understand what kind of impact they have. And that again can feed back into, do we need regulation? Do we need like oversight for these kind of platforms? What platforms are in scope? What kind of restrictions can we apply. For example, in this regulation, you also see that they have like special carve-outs for very large online platforms, as they call themselves. So they do, so even like the regulation takes into account that you have like very large players with very large reach, which have like an additional responsibility. And then you might have smaller players which do not have the same kind of impact, and where maybe the burden of these additional restrictions and of this additional transparency would be too high. But it does take this into account, and just make sure that this is balanced. But indeed, in the end, you need some sort of oversight, because otherwise, if these platforms are let loose, then you get these issues that we see right now. And again, like, public awareness is nice, public scrutiny is nice, but it's not the end. It's not necessarily the solution.
All right. Victor, thank you very much for this exciting talk, for the cool research you're doing. It was super exciting.
Thank you for inviting me.
We hope to see you again here soon at some point, certainly back in Leuven in February or March. I wish everyone a good winter and happy Festivus, or whatever you're celebrating. The next seminar will be what?
Good summer on the other half of the planet.
A good summer on the other half of the planet, exactly. No floods, no hurricanes, and the next seminar here will again be online. Probably, I don't think we're going to change the format, because we're reaching just a super exciting crowd of people with doing this online in mid-January. I can't really tell you which talk it will be. We have a couple of options, but it will appear on the website and on the mailing list and on Twitter. So whatever channel you choose to follow our non-political advertising, you will be reached. Thank you, everyone, and have a great winter or summer.